Welcome back, everybody. Thanks to, shall we say, the gigantic amount of material that we have to wade through for an episode such as the War on Yugoslavia special edition. This has turned it into a special editions plural, of course, which it was necessitated by the fact that there is so much to say, and this is just mainly based on the war over Kosovo and the fallout from that. We haven't even really got into the earlier stages of the war involving Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia. Maybe that's something to return to in a future episode. But
Indeed.
due to universal acclaim, and thanks to everybody who watched and fed back to us on the last episode of this one, we are back with the follow-up this week. And Kit, it's another story with more twists and turns than the most imaginatively written spy thriller, I think.
Indeed. I mean, given that spy thrillers are usually not very imaginative, I think it's even worthy of greater plaudit than that. But yeah, I mean, we rounded out last week's show by talking about a very pivotal moment within the bombing of Yugoslavia, which was the destruction of the Chinese embassy based on CIA targeting data by NATO fighter bombers. And I think that actually leads us quite conveniently into a forgotten component of the war on Yugoslavia, which is that we came so close to an all-out Iraq-style invasion of the country, which has been was a subject of significant controversy at the time and has now been forgotten, but in itself is quite a remarkable tale.
Yes, and this is something that I recall from the time, because there was a lot of fevered speculation in the British press at the time about whether Blair was going to lead the way on a full-scale invasion. And this is, of course, the first subject we will turn to today. The issue being whether the bombing was working in terms of ultimately the regime change operation that the British quite clearly had in mind, and the Americans too. And this wasn't working, as we covered last week, in terms of the whether they were getting a domestic rebellion amongst the Yugoslav population. They weren't. Whether they were advancing the cause of the KLA in Kosovo, they weren't initially. And so it turned. What happened was you get a turn towards sort of more aggressive speculation about the possibilities of some kind of invasion, and that this was going to be an invasion which the British played a very prominent role in, or wanted to play a prominent role in, which is, of course, what Blair was keen on until, of course, he had to face certain realities, which were that, of course, this would be a potential disaster. But Kit, do you want to start off with talking about what these insane plans can? The Blair and the British government were the ones blazing the trail over this, as much as they are over Ukraine now.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I wrote an article for the Grey Zone on some declassified, amazingly revealing declassified British Ministry of Defence files. So revealing, I'm shocked they got into the public domain at all, particularly without any redactions. And in my investigation, I used the subheading "British proposals for a US invasion of Yugoslavia" because that's what they were planning. Was they were going to invade Yugoslavia, with Britain playing a prominent role, prominent in the visible sense, but actually their practical material contribution to this would have been virtually nothing. So they drew up a variety of separate, this is towards the end of April, when, as we've discussed, this is when public support for the bombing started to run out of steam. This is when we're heading into the attack on the the Chinese embassy, as we discussed. There is among the declassified Ministry of Defense documents, there was I think it's about 5 pages listing ground force options for invading Yugoslavia, and this ran the gamut from simply sending a bunch of soldiers to try and serve as military police in Kosovo, to all-out invasion with the ultimate intention of toppling Milosevic. Completely insane, but because, as we've discussed, the bombing was such an embarrassing failure from a military perspective, and the same papers note that Blair was extremely worried that because of the Yugoslav army's success in vanquishing the KLA, that there was a very real risk that Milosevic could declare victory and dictate terms, which Blair said that he would reject any offers from Milosevic whatsoever, despite the failure of the bombing. Actually, we got very, 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 very close to an invasion. Now, there is a November 1999 Washington Post, New York Times, they're inseparable in my mind, article on this, where it states that in early June, Tony Blair had ordered the preparation of 30,000 letters calling up the British Army reserves. They were typed and addressed and about to go out in the mail, so Britain could commit 50,000 soldiers to invading Yugoslavia. President Clinton, quote unquote, with enormous reluctance, was about to give his own approval, sending hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, despite the fact that he had previously pledged that there was no prospect of this happening. Now, this speaks to what a military embarrassment the bombing of Kosovo was, and I've written for my website in an article called "The Delusion of U.S. Air Power." Pretty much on a daily basis, U.S. and NATO and Western officials were boasting about the success of their surgical strikes against Milosevic. And, our brave boys are battering the Serb butcher and clobber slobber and blah 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 blah. Actually, over and over again in these documents, it is stated, well, the airstrikes we carried out yesterday, which destroyed the Interior Ministry, were completely pointless. And don't really appear to have served any purpose whatsoever from our perspective. So yes, they decided to draft up a plan of action for invading Yugoslavia. But I mean, hilariously, I think probably similar to the discussions which are being had about trying to, or were being had, about trying to insert foreign soldiers into Ukraine. The policy document, which listed these options ranging from occupying Kosovo to occupying Belgrade and marching Milosevic out of the presidential residence in handcuffs. There were all sorts of issues that they encountered, including like the fact that there was likely going to be a lot of local opposition to their presence there. We could have seen a World War II style partisan response to the presence of British and American soldiers in Yugoslavia. A lot of people would not have tolerated that, and there was also the problem that in order to invade Serbia, they would have had to use a neighboring country to do so. Now, Serbia neighbors Yugoslavia, and to this day Serbia neighbors Greece, with which it has deep and cohering cultural, historic, fraternal ties. Greece was never going to agree to this. There was Macedonia, which wasn't a member of NATO, and they were extremely worried that this would drag them into the war. Albania, which supported the KLA and was the headquarters for NATO throughout the bombing, they also feared Serb retaliation. So there were all of these issues with this plan, but Blair was absolutely determined to go ahead with this to an extent which I think speaks to his kind of evangelical derangement. Actually, now there is a included in the show notes is a personal memo, just to show the extent to which Blair was directing all of this. He personally, right, like the wanton destruction of civilian infrastructure on an absolutely massive scale, and destroying a TV station, killing journalists and people inside, and trapping dozens in the rubble for days afterwards, which Blair said, well, it's Milosevic's fault for not getting them out sooner. And yeah, anyway, there's a memo which yes, here we go. It's a note for the record signed by Tony Blair, or just initial TB, and he says he offers a lot of complaints about how we must how this campaign is not going like we want it to. We need to strengthen the targets. Media and communication are utterly essential. Oil, infrastructure, all the things Milosevic values, plus targeting specifically anything to do with the MUP, which was the Yugoslav police service. He said all of this was clearly justified. What is holding this back? And he closes out saying, I have little doubt we are moving towards a situation where our aims will become removing Milosevic. We will not want to say so now, but autonomy for Kosovo inside Serbia is becoming absurd due to the NATO bombing, of course. And plainly, Milosevic will threaten the stability of the region as long as he remains. And I mean, all sorts of complaints about how we're not getting our message across to the media and blah, 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 because that's all that he actually really cared about was comms. Yeah, like what Blair was suggesting was completely illegal. Now, as my dear friend John McAvoy of the indispensable Declassified UK has written about, other declassified files which escape my personal attention in the National Archives show that Britain's then Attorney General during the bombing of Yugoslavia repeatedly warned Blair and other government officials that what you are doing is completely illegal. The targets that you're going after are not legitimate. There are very, very there are very, very, very serious questions about the way this is being, the legal questions about the way this is being conducted. There was the potential of litigation in the European Court of Human Rights, the International Court of Justice, and the European Court of Justice, because it was so brazen what they were doing, just like targeting apartment blocks. Nothing that could be legit in any way construed as a legitimate military target. Of course, in the present day, as we're seeing over the course of the Gaza genocide, a legitimate military target is whatever a Western puppet or Western leader says is a legitimate military target, because reasons. But I think this Declassified UK report is worth reading in full, because it's an excellent breakdown of how belligerent the Blair government was overall, and more generally they're absolutely horrendous. And this was during Robin Cook spoke a lot about a humanitarian foreign policy. Well,
I think it was an ethical foreign policy, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, sorry. Yes, ethical foreign policy, and then there was like a different Blair war every year he was in office, pretty much.
Yes, he finally found some objections to the Iraq war, but the war on Yugoslavia was every bit as disgusting. It just lacked a full-blown ground invasion, which, as we can see from these declassified files and this article, was something they came very close to doing. So, I mean, quite why Robin Cook's reputation recovered, due to, like, he's an objection to the Iraq war only after he'd been relegated from the foreign secretary role just shows how low the standards of the British left actually are. That some rabid supporter of the Kosovo War and the destruction of Yugoslavia is now seen as some sort of progressive because he found a conscience after he'd lost access to, you know, Lancaster House or whatever. The point being that the ground invasion in the end doesn't go ahead, and it doesn't go ahead for multiple reasons. Partially because my recollection of the time is that there was a lot of controversy about this in the United States. Clinton was probably not on particularly secure ground in doing this. I mean, even I remember George W. Bush, of all people, criticizing Clinton and Gore for getting too involved in what he called nation-building operations. In fact, if you look at back at 1999, 2000, George W. Bush era presidential campaigning, he was sounded like Donald Trump, which is funny.
No, he was isolation. He was isolationist, and there are like, I mean, the Adam Curtis Power of Nightmares has numerous clips of Bush saying, you know, I don't think we should impose our standards on the rest of the world. Interestingly, of course, Tony Blair was in conversations with George Bush from the word go, because one of Blair's closest advisors just so happened to visit Texas and meet George W. Bush when he announced he was running for president, and worked out ways that they could collude, for want of a better word. But yes, I think this is a very interesting and largely forgotten aspect of the war in Yugoslavia. And I think that, again, yes, it is a testament to the embarrassing failure of the bombing. We'll get into more of that later. But also there is an amazing excerpt from Andrew Marr, who is you know, a client journalist of some disrepute, and a veteran who was very close to the Blair government and very, very pro-war, even if speaking in quote unquote neutral BBC language. There is that infamous footage of him saying, Tony Blair said that we could take Baghdad without a bloodbath. He stands vindicated, and a bigger man and a bigger prime minister as a result, or kind of, you know, vomit-inducing phraseology of that ilk after the Iraq invasion. But he wrote a book called, Marr wrote a book called A History of Modern Britain. It has a section on how Kosovo had a revolutionary impact on Blair's thinking. Now, it states he learned, and bear in mind that the Marr's book acknowledges that the bombing was a complete disaster, and that Blair, and that we came close to invasion as a result, and NATO killed many innocent civilians with their indiscriminate bombing. There is a section where Marr states, Blair learned from Kosovo to ignore criticism from the left and right. He learned to cope with giving orders which resulted in much loss of life. He learned an abiding hostility to the media. And Kosovo, along with Desert Fox and Sierra, which was the bombing of Iraq in 1998, and Sierra Leone, convinced him of his ability to lead in war, to take big gambles, and to get them right. However, the most important thing that Blair learned, and this is of enormous relevance to everything that followed this, including the Iraq War and the Ukraine proxy war, particularly. This is an incredible excerpt. Blair worried that he had tried to bounce Clinton too obviously over Kosovo. He therefore learned that American presidents need tactful handling, which is to say that Blair learned that American presidents need to be effectively manipulated. They need to be led into doing Britain's dirty work, not so obviously, through manipulation and deception tactics. As I say, enormous relevance to so many conflicts since this. I mean, you've got to bear in mind that in the wake of 9/11, the first thing that happened that Blair did was get on the phone to Bush, send him a bust of Winston Churchill, evoking Churchill's December 1941 address to Congress following Pearl Harbor, which heralded the US entry into World War II at last. And at the same time, Blair was writing to George W. saying he should exploit maximum global sympathy for America produced by 9/11 to launch military interventions across the Middle East. The tail wagging the dog, perhaps. It's an interesting question as ever.
Well,
Sorry, go ahead.
Well, let's just pause to reflect on this a moment, because I think this can tell us a lot about various different things that have gone on over the last 25 years or so, or 26 years since the attack on Yugoslavia, which is the representation, and I think you and I will probably return to this in a future episode on the relationship between British and US imperialism. I remember, as I'm pretty sure you will as well, like the anti-war movement of 20 years ago. One of the big criticisms that it had was that Britain was operating as America's poodle, and that Blair was portrayed famously by Steve Bell, the cartoonist in The Guardian, as like George W. Bush's pet dog. This, I think, has led the British anti-war movement to make a number of mistakes, this point of view, in terms of understanding the British ruling class and their role in the world. And this view goes back a long time. I think it goes back all the way to the post-World War II era, where there was this commonly held point of view that the Brits were now playing this secondary role and were actually being sort of pushed around by the Americans. In actual fact, the relationship is far more complicated than that, which is that the idea for the Iraq War comes just as much from London as it does from those who are referred to as neoconservatives in the United States. In fact, given that we know that George W. Bush was under the influence of isolationist forces, or more typically isolationist forces in the United States, until, of course, the intervention. I mean, there's some blame Dick Cheney, others, can blame the British influence. I mean, there's a lot of things going on there, but I think it's pretty clear now that a lot of these wars were planned every bit as much in London as they were in shady DC think tanks, and that the most rabid elements in the US are working constantly with London to push this, and that London is almost entirely, when it comes to these things, unified on the pursuit of these aggressive wars of conquest, using the US to do the dirty work. So what is your reflection on this, Kit, with regard to how the anti-war movement in Britain has made a political mistake with regard to the power of the British ruling class and their influence over the wars of the last, say, 30 years?
Yeah, well, I mean, what you just said was devastatingly eloquent and incisive. I think you and I have even discussed writing a book about this topic, about how people get the British and American relationship wrong, particularly on the left. Now, I have, ever since the start of the war in Ukraine, have said this is a British proxy conflict. It is being led by the British. It is being managed by the British. It is being directed by the British. It was provoked by the British. I've caught an enormous amount of flack from people for taking this position, because many, including people who consider themselves dissidents or people on the left, they view Britain purely as America's lapdog, who says how high whenever they're asked to jump. Now that is true, but There is another component of this, which is that central to British thinking since 1945 has been this notion of steering the US in directions that benefit the British ruling class ideologically, politically, financially. This is spelled out in Foreign Office memos from like towards the end of World War II, when they realised they would be a much reduced power following the conflict's termination. And so, like, what is baked into British thinking and is often spelled out in black and white into classified files when the British intelligence is carrying out some kind of propaganda or destabilization operation in the global South. One of their core objectives, again, often just spelled out verbatim, is to ensure US hegemony locally. Because if you are completely dependent on US power to remain relevant, then you are also going to be completely devoted to maintaining that hegemony. You know, and this is like, I mean, in a practical sense, the Falklands, for instance. This is of course regarded as a plucky, courageous British triumph, where the British Navy sailed halfway across the world, spent 3 weeks to get there, and bought the fascist junta. They couldn't have done this without US refueling in the Atlantic Ocean, without US air cover, without US missiles, without US intelligence. They could have done literally nothing, and the Malvinas would have rightly remained the Malvinas. So in that context, when you're so dependent, you are going to be working overtime, or so much of your energy is going to be invested in ensuring that that the US doesn't, quote unquote, step away from global leadership, because then you are left standing there with your dick in your hand. Now, I might add, and this is, I think, this is something that we've discussed on the show before, but it bears repeating. You've got to bear in mind that we have it in black and white that Chris Donnelly, a British military intelligence veteran that we have spoken about ad infinitum on this show, and he is the key architect of the proxy war in Ukraine. In 2014, he openly stated to a British Parliamentary Defence Select Committee, Britain taking the lead in arming and training the Ukrainian military will be a great way of disrupting the Obama administration's Asia pivot. It will mean their focus is retrained on Europe and the Middle East, and Britain is well placed to do this. Okay, so I mean, of course, within the Obama administration, there were figures like Victoria Nuland, of course, who wanted all-out war with Russia and were on board with this. But at the very center, officially, there was the Obama doctrine of non-intervention in Ukraine because it was a core interest of Russia, not the US.
Yes, well, and also the Obama pivot to Asia is the same policy as Trump's. Basically, it is essentially that there has been a split in the U.S. ruling class for well over a decade now, with some of them favoring like taking out Russia, some of them favoring trying to take out China, some of them just obsessed with Iran, and the sort of the inability to agree on a clear strategy for US imperialism reflects their own contradictions, but also the influence of the British, who keep pushing for this renewed assault on Russia, because, of course, this would serve British interests the most, given that the British ruling class is a lot more conflicted over China than they are about Russia. And so hence they keep pushing the US back towards recommitting to the aggression on Russia, as we've seen over and over again. Now, the point we want to get across to viewers, and I think the point that we want viewers to keep in mind, is that this narrative of like British total subservience to the interests of the US, this needs to be unlearned, so to speak. And this represents there's been an awful lot of political mistakes made since the early 1950s, starting with the old Communist Party of Great Britain, who said in their British Road to Socialism that Britain was near being colonized by the US. Now, this isn't true. The truth is that the British ruling class retained an awful lot of influence in the world. Yes, they had to accept playing second fiddle and giving up certain things to the US, but that didn't mean that they weren't dangerous and capable of like wreaking havoc across various different places in the world that were essentially neo-colonies of Britain or the US or some combination of the two. So this is the last 70 plus years of like British leftism and their analysis of like what British imperial power is needs to be fundamentally reassessed in the light of what we know now about the British role in Kosovo, which is, again, this is a matter of public record, about the British role in the Ukraine war, again, thanks to Kit's reporting and others, we know is a matter of public record now. That the British role in this is incredibly significant. And also, this explains why there is literally no dissent allowed over Ukraine. Nothing. The internal atmosphere about Ukraine is even more repressive than it is about Palestine. Because in Palestine, there are over the Palestine question, there's more disagreement. Over Ukraine, it's complete uniformity, because this is a British ruling class priority. It's a British war in all but name. So this is something which is very much spelt out by the Kosovo war. Now, shall we just move to the post-war environment, Kit? Now,
yeah, sure.
First of all, let's just spell out how the war ended, because I think this is important to understand. The war ended after essentially Milosevic was told by the Russian government at the time, still headed by Yeltsin and his comprador clique, that they would not continue, they would not back Yugoslavia in the event of this war continuing, and that Milosevic should sign whatever deal was in front of him now, basically, because the Russian government wouldn't back him. And that was like the last possible hope that the Yugoslavs had, which was that the Russians would aid them and they could continue to hold out and essentially, well, do what the Ansar Allah learned to do 26 years later, which is essentially sit there and dare the US to attack. The US attacks, the US fails in a deeply embarrassing fashion and has to scuttle off and sign a peace agreement. It's my contention, and I again, as somebody who lives in the former Yugoslavia, your impression on this will be most valuable. Like, that's not inconceivable as to something that could have happened 26 years ago, given, other than Blair's rabid delusions, given the very real limitations on US and British power, the very real divisions within NATO, and the potential for like mass resistance amongst the particularly like the Serb and wider Yugoslav population. This war could have ended extremely badly for NATO and British imperialism. It was the role of the Yeltsin clique that was absolutely crucial to selling out the Yugoslavs and encouraging Milosevic to capitulate. But what's your impression on that? And can you talk a little bit more about like the how the war actually ended?
Yeah, sure. So, in effect, yes, as you say, there is and this is something we can get into. There was this when I believe it was on June 3rd, 1999, Milosevic finally, quote unquote, capitulated and agreed to withdraw the Yugoslav military from Kosovo. Now, this was hailed as a victory for NATO, a victory for air power, a victory for blah 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 by Western leaders. The reality was, as you say, Yeltsin and his comprador clique like threw Milosevic under the bus. Now, you've got to bear in mind that Yevgeny Primakov, who was the Russian prime minister at the time, was so disgusted when he learned literally midair while he was flying to the US that the bombing had started. He was so disgusted that he had the plane turned around in midair back to Moscow. So there were elements of the Yeltsin government who were bitterly opposed to this and felt that action of some kind should and could be taken. But Yeltsin ultimately threw Milosevic under the bus. So yeah, Milosevic signed an agreement which effectively allowed NATO unimpeded, unchallenged freedom of movement throughout the province, and there was along with NATO forces, there was a UN peacekeeping force known as KFOR that was deployed to the province. Now, there was a gap of several days between the withdrawal of the Yugoslav army on June 9th and the arrival about I think it was the best part of a week later of NATO and the UN. Now, in that brief period, a total genocide of the province's non-Albanian population had already erupted. A large, vast number of people, including Albanians who were terrified of the KLA, had fled into the province to Serbia and Montenegro because they were absolutely terrified about what the KLA was going to do / was doing, which was intimidating people out of their homes, drive-by shootings, grenade attacks, the disappearances of often younger Serbs, both male and female. Their bodies never found. It is highly likely that the KLA was harvesting their organs. This was a core source of income for them, along with the drug trade and people trafficking. And so, yes, KFOR arrived in this environment of total chaos, but then effectively just stood by while it was happening. And there is a eponymous account of this effort called Operation Joint Guardian, written by a US military historian called Cody R. Phillips. There are some other resources on what happened, including an OSCE report, which documents in often very difficult to read detail, women being blown apart at markets by grenades, and grandmothers having their throats slit, Serbs being publicly hanged, just also it was an almost unbelievable level of sadism and violence. Now, in his account, Cody Phillips states, ethnic Albanians consumed with hatred initiated a wave of destruction. Anything Serbian was destroyed or vandalized, even abandoned houses and churches. Much of the violence was organized and deliberate. Each day, American soldiers confronted new expressions of hatred. Radical groups of ethnic Albanians were committed to violence in Kosovo, with the ultimate goal of achieving complete independence from Serbia and bringing along as well bits of territory in Serbia and Macedonia dominated by ethnic Albanians. Chaos dominated. So, I mean, yeah, it is very difficult to read. There are, as I say, there are numerous contemporary accounts of this, but it was an attempt to achieve a ethnically pure Kosovo, which was the KLA's openly stated objective all along, and was the inevitable upshot of the Yugoslav military leaving the province and the KLA being given a free rein. Now, the many mainstream accounts, to the extent that they exist, of this surge of violence and bloodletting, they tend to frame it as the they tend to frame the failure of KFOR to keep the peace and prevent the genocide and displacement of non-Albanians, which included Roma. There were many Roma communities that were burned to the ground by the KLA and other Albanian nationalist radicals. The mainstream accounts are tend to veer towards, well, it was well-meaning incompetence and ineptitude that led to this violence and prevented the UN and NATO from doing anything to prevent it. I actually know personally several people who were my age when this happened, which is to say, like 10. Who were marched alongside their families out of their homes at gunpoint by the KLA, while UN and NATO peacekeepers just stood there and did nothing. And there was this is included in the show notes. There was a letter, I believe it was in 2010. There was a letter sent by a commanding officer of one of the NATO units in Kosovo, where he talks about how the Blair government effectively actively encouraged this violence. So, like, on a pretty much nightly basis, when his peacekeeping unit was patrolling Kosovo, they would run into gangs of KLA thugs who are armed with guns and knives and knuckle dusters. They would arrest them. They would report back to base. Oh, well, we've caught this bunch of gangsters who were about to try and force Serbs from their homes in apartment blocks. And then they were told by their military and political superiors in London, let them go. Consistently. He talks about how the violence meted out by the KLA shocked even the most hardened of paratroopers. There was systematic murder of Serbs, often shot in front of their families. This was commonplace. It just goes on and on and on. And like, it is that he effectively states that the legacy of this endures to this day. Now, he was writing in 2010. That's now 15 years ago. That legacy continues to pervade today. Like during the over the past few years, there's been a significant uptick in violence towards the remaining population of Serb population of Kosovo, which is ever dwindling. It's only a few hundred thousand, particularly under the rule of Albin Kurti, who's the Prime Minister of Kosovo, and has he is a hardcore Albanian nationalist who believes in union with Albania. This violence continues to this day, with like the routine ransacking of Serb property. There were like the Serb dinar, which was used. That's which was used in northern Kosovo, has been banned. Vast quantities were seized from post offices and banks to prevent people using them. There was a case not so long ago of a police officer who, just driven by hatred, shot a Serb teenager, almost killing them. And then he got a few years in prison as a result. I think it was like 2 or 3, and he'll probably be out in 1 if he's imprisoned at all. And it was also found that a number of his colleagues had helped to cover up his responsibility for the crime. They weren't held accountable at all. So it is a kind of slow motion attempt to erase what was what remains of the Serb population, which, as Robert Fisk reported in November 1999, had reduced Pristina, which is the capital of Kosovo. Within 6 months, the Serb population of Pristina had been reduced from 40,000 to 400.
Yes.
And
so let's just pause there for a second to reflect upon like the actual real impact of the NATO occupation and empowering of the KLA in Kosovo, which is that Kosovo, in the period of Yugoslavia, socialist Yugoslavia, certainly towards the end, certainly there were very severe problems there, which were prompted by, as we covered last week, what I would identify as severe political mistakes by the Tito-ite leadership, compounded by the intervention of outside powers, particularly the imperialists. However, even into the 90s, Kosovo was a multi-ethnic place. Since then, since the NATO intervention, which was said at the time and justified loudly by all these paid hacks on the BBC, ITN, Channel 4, etc., all the major national newspapers, including, of course, The Guardian, The Independent, as being to prevent a genocide, it facilitated one. It facilitated mass population expulsion. Milosevic was accused of being in league with all kinds of organized crime elements. In actual fact, what was unleashed in Kosovo by the occupation was essentially a US protectorate run by a combination of fascists and outright organized crime figures who were engaged in organ harvesting, people trafficking, sex trafficking, arms dealing, and narcotics dealing. What Kosovo became, even by the admission of bourgeois journalists like that idiot Misha Glenny, who wrote a terrible book on Yugoslavia, which I had the misfortune to read many years ago. Even he admitted in his book Mafia that Kosovo was a center for all of this like organized crime activity. And so what you get is NATO created exactly what they accused Milosevic of trying to create, which is an ethnically purged place run by gangsters, run on the basis of basically organized criminality. That's what Kosovo has become. It went from being somewhere which had a decent level of development to being somewhere which was asset stripped by the occupiers, including, of course, Madeleine Albright, who profited from it personally, as we covered last week, to being this backward place run by a comprador clique who essentially spend all their time purging the remaining Serb population when they're not pocketing cash from corrupt investment deals and organized crime. That's what Kosovo is, and that's what the US and British imperialists created. It's also worth emphasizing that this isn't a one-off. Look at Ukraine. It's exactly the same. Look at, the Baltic states, just another version of it. Look at Israel, a slightly more developed version of it. It's always the same, which is you end up with like these corrupt, depraved places ruled over by these fascistic lunatics who spend all their time persecuting the minority population, or in the case of Israel, the majority population, overseen by the British and the Americans, because that's what Britain and America and their respective ruling classes bring to places all the time and in every single circumstance. Chaos, criminality, extreme versions of like racism, and rule by fascist and gangster clique. That's what Britain, the British and American imperialism do everywhere they've gone. And Kosovo is a smaller model of what has been done in Ukraine. I don't suppose you disagree with that assessment, Kit, but do you have anything more to add to it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think we spoke last week, last edition, about the parallels between what the KLA was doing and aiming for, and the militant Uyghur separatists in Xinjiang. Like what the groups like ETIM, the East Turkestan Independence Movement, and their adherents, which includes US-funded organizations like the World Uyghur Congress, they advocate for an ethnically pure Xinjiang. And several prominent Uyghur independence campaigners have said if that needs to be achieved by force, then that's what we'll have to do. So there is a very clear parallel there, and of course, an ethnically pure purely Turkic Xinjiang would also mean that they would have to get rid of a lot of Mongols who have been there longer than they have. But like these are the kind of forces that over and over and over again the Anglo-American Empire supports all over the world. They are very good at drumming up sympathy for such groups using, NGOs, like media assets, etc., and then manufacturing consent for, oh, well, we need to do something about this. And like people keep falling for it. I am amazed at how many people I know on the left who should know better in every way fell for the idea that there was targeted persecution, if not genocide, of the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, when the reality, as with Kosovo, was that the Chinese central government was responding to a very serious and grave and real security situation. A lot of people keep on getting taken in by the same lies. Now, I might add as well that there is a quite remarkable report that was published in 2000 by uh, the British Parliament's Foreign Affairs Committee. Now, it has a number of pretty damning findings, such as the KLA were responsible for deliberately provoking the conflict and killing civilians in order to precipitate NATO intervention. It acknowledges that Rambouillet, which we discussed on the last episode, was a setup. It imposed non-negotiable terms that no sovereign country would ever willingly accept. And it has this amazing quote in it that states that ensuring Yugoslavia's rejection was absolutely vital, because unless Milosevic could be blamed for the collapse of the talks, it would be difficult to justify the use of force against him. Okay, so it also notes that there was no plan to target Albanian civilians. There were some crimes committed against them, but it was not part of a concerted, orchestrated effort. There are indications that the Kosovo police seized the opportunity to settle some scores and steal some people's property, but again, that's about some paramilitary groups might have on their own initiative committed some atrocities, but again, they weren't directed to do so by Yugoslavia's military or political chiefs. However, for all of this kind of damning content, the report concludes by stating that there is not only little likelihood in the short to medium term of a multi-ethnic society being secured in Kosovo, but it actually views this as a potentially positive thing. And it states that the ambiguity about the future of Kosovo's status may well be the best course of action to follow. So ensuring that Kosovo remains this ethnically divided, completely unstable, and barely functional society with high levels of unemployment, massive levels of organized crime, corruption. Actually, that works best from the Britain's perspective. And that quote unquote ambiguity would be the best means of ultimately wresting Kosovo from Yugoslavia, because it would justify a perpetual British presence there, which endures to this day.
Yes.
It's absolutely astonishing to have it spelled out in black and white like that. But
well, that is the objective, which is that if they're also by having this running sore there that remains unresolved, that's actually, as you say correctly, that justifies an ongoing British and American presence there. It also makes sure that you've got a gun permanently at the head of the Serbian government, which is again something that the British very much want to do. And we can see, as you covered it repeatedly over the last few years, this provokes various interventions in the British Parliament from various security state assets calling for action against Vučić and the Serbian government, because they are, then they need to be sort of pushed back into line again. So the aim is not to build a secure and stable Kosovo. The aim is to have a client state which can be used to various different ends. And if that means sacrificing the Kosovo Albanians, then they'll do it. Of course they will. As they will ultimately, in the end, and we'll cover this in a future episode, sacrifice the Zionists, because again, these people are all just tools to the British. They've sacrificed so many minority nationalities and ethnic groups who've had the poor judgment amongst their leadership to become tools of the British and the Americans, get thrown under the bus at when the opportunities that having them on their side present to the British, run out, dry up, then it's game over and you're tossed to the four winds. So this is something which I think everybody who considers becoming an ally of the British or the Americans should more properly consider, given the track record here. But the other point I wanted to raise just on this was of course, the ally came to a conclusion had extremely little to do with like NATO military prowess or the bombing campaign. It was, in actual fact, a victory of PR hype over the reality, which was that the squalid Comprador clique in Moscow sold out the Yugoslavs and everything flowed from there. And the air war was then sold as this miracle that they would then try and use in campaigns in the future. But as the Newsweek article that you've included in the show notes, which we're sharing on the screen now, properly covers, this was really a failure. And it was a failure which they drew all the wrong lessons from.
Yeah, precisely. And no, I mean, I've written about this, again, shameless plug for my website in an article called The Delusion of US Air Power. The lie and the willful self-deception that the bombing of Yugoslavia was a military success has enormous relevance today. And what's quite remarkable is if you look at the kind of initial media reports when from June 1993, when Yugoslav forces withdrew from Kosovo, numerous outlets observed that they were completely unscathed by the bombing. And their soldiers seemed, defiant and keen to keep fighting. And that also as well that Kosovo seemed to be lacking the scorched carcasses of tanks or other military equipment, which you might expect to find if the bombing had been remotely successful. So this all changed when a senior Pentagon apparatchik. He gave a press conference in June, toward kind of mid-June, after the Yugoslavs had left, where he presented all of these graphic charts boasting about how hundreds of Yugoslav tanks and personnel carriers and artillery pieces had been decimated by NATO, and this knocked all skepticism and cynicism about the campaign from the mainstream media's radar. Now, I might add that the aforementioned declassified British Ministry of Defence files have all sorts of references to how not only was the bombing pointless, but a post-campaign analysis found that they had not degraded the Yugoslav military in any meaningful way. The Yugoslavs had used camouflage and dummy targets, like I think I mentioned on a previous episode, but they would insert, like, say, a pipe into the windscreen of a battered old car, and this would be believed to be a tank by NATO flying from thousands of miles above. And so it basically concluded that the files concluded that this was a failure. Now, the entire campaign. It was not until May 2000 that Newsweek, as we've got up on screen now, it published an extensive investigation into the quote-unquote Kosovo cover-up, which contains a wide variety of quite extraordinary excerpts about how Wesley Clark, who oversaw the bombing campaign, and I think, as we discussed last week, also then sought to line his pockets from privatization in Kosovo after the bombing, specifically using his military history as a reason for why he should be given sweetheart deals. He was so flummoxed when he learned that there was very little evidence of damage to the Yugoslav military. He dispatched a team of US Air Force investigators to Kosovo who spent weeks combing the province by helicopter and foot. They turned up evidence of just 14 destroyed tanks out of hundreds claimed. Meanwhile, of the 744 successful strikes on Yugoslav military equipment and installations claimed by Pentagon officials, just 58 were confirmed. And there was also, the Newsweek also goes into all manner of deception methods that the Yugoslav military employed, such as making a fake bridge, which was destroyed by NATO several times. And Clark's response to this was that Yugoslavia had simply hidden their damaged equipment and the team hadn't looked hard enough. So a completely bogus report was fabricated whole cloth by the US Air Force, validating the fiction that NATO's campaign had been a success and the destruction of Yugoslav forces had been extensive. But the report even acknowledged that there was no supporting data for this, i.e., we are just making this up. Now, Newsweek concludes with this eerily prescient section, which talks about how the distortion that the bombing of Yugoslavia was a success could badly mislead future policymakers. It noted that soon the Pentagon was going to go through one of its quadrennial reviews, assigning spending priorities, and the US Air Force would claim the lion's share. The lesson of Kosovo is that bombing against military targets is overrated and is not a successful way of waging war. Now, that distortion has endured ever since. And, you know, if you look at US military spending today, almost a quarter is spent on the Air Force, which is the biggest single expenditure. After that, that's about 216 billion. After that, it's the Navy on about 200 billion. They obviously work hand in hand because the US relies on aircraft carriers to ferry those fighter jets around the world. As we have seen with first Operation Prosperity Guardian and then the Trump administration's renewed attempts to crush Ansar Allah and break their anti-genocide blockade of the Red Sea, air power, this belief in the supremacy of air power endures. And it has just been demonstrated twice in under a year in Yemen to not work and be completely ineffective.
Yes, and the ultimate lesson that many anti-imperialist groups have been drawing since 1999 is that the US really is a paper tiger when actually called upon to do real fighting. They only succeeded in Yugoslavia due to, as we've said, the actions of the Yeltsin Comprador clique. They only succeeded in Libya and Syria, thanks mainly to the fact that they were able to essentially place not only siege sanctions on these countries, but also use a gigantic series of mercenary armies to essentially carry out conquests there. With no mercenary army available, or with one that had been like roundly defeated by the Yemenis, the US and the British proved to be almost entirely impotent against against Yemen. And so the 26 years after the bombing campaign against Yugoslavia, the full lessons of it are now learned in terms of the inability of the US and the British to impose themselves on a country that has a population unified behind as we say, call it a national liberation force of a government, and is determined to fight them on the ground and determined to force them to actually commit troops. They won't do that, and they can't do that, and therefore there's nothing they could do about Yemen. And also, again, on a much bigger scale, when the Russians put their foot down and said, if you send your forces into Ukraine, we'll kill them, Keir Starmer suddenly started to back off and waffle and waver before starting waffling in another direction again. But he can't do anything. This is the thing, like this is what has finally been revealed now. So let's just turn quickly then to to another couple of issues before moving on to the next section here. We had admissions follow shortly after the end of the Kosovo War, including from even such sources as the BBC, where they reported that the Serbs weren't actually carrying out a genocide in Kosovo in 1998 and 1999. This was later admitted, and it goes back to what we were saying earlier, which was that everything NATO accused, or the US and the British accused Milosevic of, is actually what they were doing. It wasn't what the Serbs were doing at all. So this is a remarkable admission. But then again, the date on this article from the BBC site is 7th of September 2001. So I guess this kind of got knocked out the news cycle within 4 days. But again, like everything that they said that the Yugoslav forces were doing in Kosovo turns out to have been overwhelmingly a series of lies.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this actually kind of it neatly leads in well to the prosecution of Milosevic, which we'll get into later. But I think what's really important to note is that during, as we discussed last week, throughout the war in Kosovo, the number of casualties claimed by US officials grew ever wilder. 100,000 people have been killed, 200,000 people have been killed. We were told of countless mass grave sites. We were told we were told that bodies were being incinerated in factories. All of this was completely untrue. And what's amazing is that Milosevic's indictment, because he was, as we mentioned in the last week's episode, he was indicted in May 1999. A State Department lawyer admits this was to try and generate renewed interest and a support for the bombing. At a time it was flagging. It was purely a political move and a propaganda ploy as well. But in effect, to this day, it is unknown the full number of casualties in Kosovo. It is quite evident that NATO killed thousands of people, including many children. That's been rather forgotten, as we discussed last week, the fact that the US bombed a large number of Kosovo Albanians, including fleeing refugee columns. So what's that phrase? Every accusation is an admission. So it's like
Yes,
I think that it's quite amazing to this day that, like, despite all of these admissions and all of these all of the publicly available evidence that there was no concerted effort to ethnically cleanse, let alone genocide, Kosovo's population, the mainstream, the indomitable mainstream narrative is that NATO's intervention prevented a looming genocide. As that May 2000 British parliamentary report found, the NATO bombing encouraged the Yugoslav military to start neutralizing the KLA. They decided to use the chaos created by the bombing to carry out military operations. So and there had been no plan to do so before the bombing started. It is a false history which has been accepted, which is universally accepted and cannot be pushed back against in the mainstream.
yes, and also the what also cannot be admitted to is that the even in so-called mainstream outlets now, I refer here to the article from Politico, which I'm going to share just on the screen. Like the mission that in Kosovo is even regarded by like political insiders now as like a total utter failure. If you look at this in terms of actual nation building, they built nothing and only created a degenerated gangster state. But we go back to the admission from the British Parliament's report, which is that an unstable, perpetually military occupied gangster state is actually exactly what they were looking for, because it enables them to, well, extract wealth, as much wealth as they can from it, and also have a military bootprint in the Balkans in perpetuity. So that's the actual aim. None of the things that they said they wanted publicly should be taken seriously. And a corrupt, squalid gangster state, again, this now has to be regarded as the actual aim of the British and the US in many of the places they go. Because again, it's not by accident that this is created in Kosovo, it's created in Ukraine and so many other places where they get dominant influence. But did you want to add anything on this Politico article and its contents?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that there is a portion of this that ties in with something a discussion we'll have later in the show. But I think the introduction to this is this piece is quite amazing. So you have Neil Bush, who is George W. Bush's little brother. He was visiting Kosovo, I believe it was at the end of 2023, to basically line his pockets via some corrupt business deal. He went there with zero knowledge or understanding of the province's history or anything about it. So he had to be given this crash course. He didn't understand how people living in a quote unquote country called Kosovo were Albanian. He didn't understand, he didn't know that George W. is a hero in Kosovo, but he's also a hero in Albania, where there's a chain of bakeries named after him. I kid you not. And statues of George H.W. Bush all over Albania as well. And he didn't know why Kosovo Albanians were Muslim even. And it's like, I think that this speaks to the fact that, yeah, that from the perspective of the Imperial Brain Trust, they're of course interested in like easy returns, but also their total ignorance of all of even like kind of effective neo-colonies they've helped create. I think it speaks to the weakness of the US empire, actually, and the fact that there is an astonishing excerpt towards the end about Camp Bondsteel, which is one of the US's biggest overseas military bases. It occupies nearly 1,000 acres, which are just south of Pristina. And it's meant to house thousands and thousands of soldiers, but there's usually only about 1,000 American troops there at any one time, to the point that it is referred to within the US military as the Forgotten Battalion. But the Politico also notes the troops there are nearly the only thing standing between Kosovo and Serbia. So it's like, the US has created, with British assistance, a corrupt, effectively narco-terrorist state in Southeast Europe, which is completely unsustainable and completely dependent on virtually non-existent US military presence to exist.
Yes.
And as we said last week, the bombing of the Yugoslavia probably represented the pinnacle of the US global empire. It also represented the point where it all started to unravel.
Yes. Well, and also it must be said that eventually the US is going to withdraw its Forgotten Battalion from Kosovo, and the Kosovan state will enter into a state of implosion very shortly afterwards, because it is only the foreign presence which is actually propping it up. It has no real industries. They've all been asset stripped by people like Wesley Clark and Madeleine Albright. It has no real ability to sustain itself, just like the Ukrainian state, because what they create are completely inefficient, completely non-sustainable states, which fall to pieces very, very quickly when the external support is ultimately withdrawn. So moving then to look at like the next stage in this particular story, which is the downfall, or the shall we say the color revolution that removed Milosevic himself. So I remember this very well, as I was about 18 at the time, and this was sort of presented as again, like all the color revolutions have been, as the great uprising against the horrific dictator. Now, it's true that what ultimately occurred was the removal of Milosevic, but this, in my analysis, occurred due to the sort of the classic combination of street mobilizations, which were influenced by the training of a cadre of activists through organizations like OTPOR, which were assisted by the British and the US intelligence services and NGO world, to mobilize people out onto the streets, create the image of destabilization, and essentially try to carry out what is in essence a gigantic psychological operation on the Serb population, including, of course, having the candidate in the presidential election, who was Milosevic's rival, be a guy who portrayed himself, this is a Vojislav Kostunica, who portrayed himself as more of a nationalist than Milosevic. But of course, he was, as it turned out, a very ineffective nationalist, and ended up like overseeing the wholesale capitulation of what was left of the Yugoslav state to imperialist interests. But can you talk a little bit, Kit, about the move to overthrow Milosevic, and ultimately what were the real reasons behind his removal?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I think that it is very clear, as we've just discussed, that it was thought that, but it was being planned to remove Milosevic as far back as the very start of the bombing. It was hoped that this would be the end of it for Milosevic, but that didn't work out. So he continued as president subsequently, and actually he got a significant popularity boost because there was this kind of blitz mentality where even his political rivals were rallying behind him as you know, under the weight of NATO bombs. Now, in December 2000, the Washington Post, I got it right this time, they published a very lengthy post-mortem on how Milosevic was overthrown. And this included, as you mentioned, the promotion of a kind of dissident youth group called OTPOR, which is Serbian for resistance. They were getting training from the National Endowment for Democracy and the CIA and British intelligence on how to market themselves, how to create this seemingly subversive anti-Milosevic movement. They were given thousands of cans of spray paint by US aid so they could daub anti-Milosevic graffiti across the country. And they were also tutored by US advertising and PR professionals in polling, in communicating with the public, in staying on message. One of OTPOR's leaders said, "We specifically sought to use corporate branding in politics. Revolutionary movements need marketing departments. We took Coca-Cola as our model." Tens of millions of dollars were funneled covertly and overtly into this by the US and Britain in just a year. The population of Yugoslavia was roughly 10 million at the time, so this meant that several dollars were in effect allocated for every single citizen of the country. The average monthly wage was just $30, so this wellspring went very far indeed, and it was quite easy to recruit people to anti-Milosevic efforts. Now, yes, underneath all of this, you have Otpor's the public face of the revolution, but you have, as what the Washington Post notes, the CIA was up to no good in Belgrade without anyone really knowing the extent of their activities, and we still don't know what they were doing. But there was also, because sanctions had been reimposed upon Yugoslavia as a result of the war in Kosovo, there was also the promise to the local population that the second that you get rid of Milosevic, well, US and Western aid is going to start flowing, the sanctions will be lifted, and the misery that's been inflicted upon you and deprived you of basic medicines and water at times will finally come to an end. So that was the kind of promise that was made to the Yugoslav public. Now, what happened was that in the was it October or November election, there was the first round of the presidential election. Milosevic won. However, NED-funded polling suggested that his opponent had won, and this triggered massive public protest due to alleged corruption in the electoral process. I might add, this is a tactic that has been used again and again and again ever since by the US to trigger color revolutions. Now, the overthrow of Milosevic is known as the bulldozer revolution because there are these very famous pictures of a wheel loader who amongst the protesters that was protecting them from attacks by police and helping protesters break into government buildings. It was, in a bitter irony, the driver of said bulldozer very quickly turned against the quote-unquote revolution he'd assisted, because in Milosevic's place, a very doggedly pro-US government advised by a coterie of free market idealists who are openly committed to breaking open Yugoslavia to international investment, quote unquote, they imposed shock therapy measures, which basically collapsed what remained of Yugoslavia's battered, sanctioned economy overnight. He had actually run a successful business under Milosevic, which collapsed. He himself went bankrupt, and he spent the rest of his life living off meager welfare payments. So, be careful what you wish for, to say the least. But this model of regime change with a public, predominantly student anti-government face, with behind the scenes underhanded meddling by the CIA, was reproduced over and over and over again. And Otpor, its activists, they went on to train a number of youth groups, including Kamara in Georgia, that was behind the 2003 Rose Revolution, Pora in Ukraine, that was behind the 2004 Orange Revolution, and they subsequently also founded a company which still operates in Belgrade, I might add, called Canvas, which goes around the world with concealed US funding, training activist groups to bring down governments. They trained Venezuelans to try and bring down Chavez, amongst other things, and they recently, members of Canvas were detained and interrogated by the police in Georgia because they've been coordinating with NED-funded activists on the ground there in order to try and overthrow the government over passing foreign agent legislation. So again, that legacy resonates very palpably to this day, and it is a model which the US has used over and over and over again.
Now, it's then that what was sold to the Yugoslav and Serbian population in particular is going to be the way forward, which was that again, same thing that the US and the British always sell to populations they want to incite against their governments. The idea that there's going to be this sort of European garden, basically, is what they are told they're going to get. What they actually get is asset stripping, destruction, economic destruction, and the reduction of the country in what you actually get, and the subjugation to US, British, German interests, which is what, of course, what happened across the rest of the former Yugoslavia. And as is noted, by the that we're going to be sharing on screen in just a second here, which is actually by Jeremy Scahill, madness grips the place, the same as is going on now in Syria, the same as what happened in Libya. It's the same story over and over and over again, because as the British government report we were talking about just a moment ago has noted, chaos and madness, in actual fact, helps imperialism in this day and age. Stability is not what they're interested in. So Serbia, after Milosevic, becomes a place which I think is still to this day contested in terms of influence between China, Russia to an extent, the EU and the US, sort of vying over control of it, with the Serb government headed by President Vucic kind of like consistently tap dancing between the different influences there, but with the Serb population being overwhelmingly in favor of alignment with China and Russia and rejecting EU NATO alignment. Kit, did you want to comment further on like the post Milosevic direction of Serbia in particular?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think that one of the most remarkable things is that the the second that they got rid of Milosevic, control of the media was basically handed over to the British and the Americans. They started pumping out relentless pro-Western, pro-EU propaganda, and there was actually a quite popular comedy serial that its name escapes me now, which featured it's all about a Serb who is constantly arguing and at war with people and ends up losing. And in the opening credits, you see the EU flag, and he's like wrestling with it. So I mean, it couldn't be more on the nose than that. But that has not been remotely effective in generating support for Western integration amongst the wider population. If you look at polls of support for joining NATO, 80% of Serbs oppose it. Figures vary depending on the pollster, but anything between 10 to maybe 30% of the population support EU membership. This is after countless millions spent on propaganda and civil society initiatives to try and get the country into both blocs. Yes, as you mentioned, the wider population overwhelmingly supports faces eastwards. They look to China and Russia as brothers. They look to them for economic assistance and military support. So it's I mean, and I think it's an interesting the war in Ukraine has made the aforementioned tap dance of Vucic a lot more difficult, but in many ways. But at the same time, it has only solidified the public's determination not to join the EU or NATO and to remain neutral. They've refused to sanction Russia, and recently, as we discussed on our Victory Day special, despite threats and bullying, Vucic attended Russia's May Day parade, and the Chinese have a significant and ever-growing economic presence in Serbia. So, I mean, I do wonder whether in the corridors of power, no matter how bought off, Serbia's political elite might be, at the same time, I do wonder whether there is an element of just trying to drag this out as long as possible, because, as you mentioned, the time will come when the US leave bonds deal. My friend Nebojša Malic has this great line, which is, well, the Turks did the Serbs a lot of damage, the Krauts did the Serbs a lot of damage, the Anglo-Americans have done us a lot of damage, but the Turks have gone, the Krauts are gone, and the Anglo-Americans are looking wobbly, to say the least. I think, and I might add as well that another interesting feature of this is that Donald Trump, his administration has a number of people within it, including his whole Balkan team, people like Richard Grenell and Jared Kushner, who have significant economic, political, and personal connections with Belgrade. We have discussed on the show before that the British ruling elite is extremely upset about this. Alicia Kearns, a British MP who has an extensive background working for British intelligence. She gave a speech in, I believe it was July 2023, where she as good as declared war on Serbia, saying that the US warming US relations with Serbia were an absolute disgrace, and that we need to beef up British military presence in the region, particularly in Bosnia and Kosovo, which has since happened. Effectively stating that it was a betrayal of US commitment to democracy to align at all with Serbia. But I mean, ultimately, one of the reasons that there is this kind of international, what would you call it, wrestling match over Serbia, it demonstrates Serbia's geopolitical significance. It is the most stable and prosperous country in the former Yugoslavia by some margin. The EU and US need Serbia a lot more than it needs them. And the local population are aware of this.
Yes, and it would seem that the maybe those in the Serb government who are just waiting to see what happens may well be proven to be correct, given that the US's globe-spanning ambitions are starting to visibly unravel now, regardless of whatever Trump's efforts are to restabilize them. But I wanted to turn finally to the selling of Milosevic to the West, to the Anglo-Americans by the Serb government just a year or less than a year after he'd been overthrown, in return for an IMF loan which apparently never even arrived. And his subsequent trial, where he quite skillfully turned the tables on his accusers and managed to get people like Wesley Clark to make an Olympian idiot out of himself on the witness stand, and managed to essentially call into question the entire validity of the War Crimes Tribunal, until, of course, his untimely death, which there is a lot of speculation about, and I'd be very interested to hear what the commonly held belief in Serbia is about this. But Kit, what was the reaction within Serbia to the government there's essentially selling Milosevic to the West back in 2001?
Well, it didn't go down well, but not least because under Serbian law, it's actually illegal to deport a Serbian citizen to another country, much like the same applies in Russia. And I mean, the ICTY already at this stage was basically viewed as a sham locally because it was. The basis of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was a CIA memo in 1993 which explicitly called for the creation of a war crimes tribunal for propaganda purposes to publicize Serb atrocities. And it also explicitly stated that war crimes committed by our Bosniak and Croat proxies should be ignored. So the ICTY was created months later and then did just that. It let Bosniak and Croat war criminals who'd committed absolutely horrendous crimes off the hook, or they got minor token sentences, often released immediately due to time served. And it was a total fudge. And various US officials have acknowledged that yes, that from our perspective, we used it for political and propaganda reasons. Now, I gather that the Milosevic was handed over despite a significant internal opposition to doing this because they thought that this would not only go down badly with the public but also that it was a breach of Yugoslav law, and there was the risk that the US was just lying to them and wouldn't stump up the funds, which they didn't in the end. But as it was, the trial of Slobodan Milosevic turned out to be a total and utter disaster for NATO powers. And it was effectively, Milosevic was charged with trying to create a greater Serbia, and was also fundamental to this was this notion that he had direct control over the Bosnian Serbs and the Croat Serbs in their own conflicts in Bosnia and Croatia, and that he supported everything that they did and what facilitated and encouraged everything they did. The trial turned over enormous amount of incontrovertible evidence proving this was not true. It started off with the prosecution a phase which lasted for several years, which is unheard of in the history of global jurisprudence. But then witness after witness, including people who were very hostile to Milosevic, actually ended up giving completely exculpatory testimony, proving that what he was saying was true. That he hadn't had control over the Bosnian and Croat Serb political or military structures. In several very embarrassing testimonies, prosecution witnesses who claimed that that Milosevic did have control over the Bosnian Serbs, when asked for examples, they couldn't provide any apart from him pushing them to sue for peace. And accept peace deals, which is like quite a remarkable, example of quote unquote control. The conviction of Radazan Karadzic in 2016. It was a very, very, the judgment runs to over 1,000 pages, and it has all of these references to how Milosevic opposed ethnic cleansing and criticized Bosnian Serb leaders for committing crimes against humanity. It found that he had refused them aid in order to try and pressure them to accept peace deals, and that he had been very critical of their attempts to seize more territory than their proportion of the population. He believed it was inhumane and unfair for them to have more than a third of the country, because that's how they were 33% of the pre-war population. But there were all manner of amazing excerpts excerpts from this very long-running prosecution section, including there was the head of Human Rights Watch, this woman called Jerry Leiber, who wrote an op-ed for the New York Times in 1990 saying that the US should support Yugoslavia's breakup and support separatist nationalist groups in the assorted republics, and then subsequently published a report claiming there was widespread communist repression of Croats, and Croats had to live under Serb hegemony. When Milosevic grilled her on the witness stand, and he was praised for his cross-examination skills by judges and lawyers alike, he was a very smart dude, like indeed. He demonstrated her, Jerry Leiber, to be a complete and total idiot. She didn't know that Tito was Croatian, for instance. He asked her basic questions about how Yugoslavia's political system worked, how its legal system worked, about basic questions about its history, and she had no idea. She didn't know that throughout the 1980s, when she was tub thumping for Yugoslavia's breakup on the basis of Croats being discriminated against, that most of the government infrastructure was filled by Croats. She didn't know that the defense minister during the Yugoslav defense minister during the war with Croatia was himself Croatian. Because it was a multi-ethnic federation, right? So like, witness after witness were made to look like fools. Smoking gun evidence never emerged, and there was also a quite incredible incident where the prosecuting lawyer was this guy called Jeffrey Nice, who, funnily enough, was part of that bullshit Uyghur tribunal that was funded by the US. He was forced to admit that there was no evidence that Milosevic supported Greater Serbia or had even spoken of it publicly or privately. And this was a huge component of his indictment, was that he sought to create a Greater Serbia. There is a very good book by John Laughlin called Travesty, which is about the trial of Slobodan Milosevic, and it has an enormous amount of very interesting information on the ICTY and Milosevic's trial in general. I might add as well that one of the greatest crimes that the ICTY committed, and it frequently breached its own rules, invented regulations and its own powers are kind of on the fly, was it created a legal precedent which is used to this day called joint criminal enterprise, which even its supporters mockingly refer to as just convict everyone. Because under joint criminal enterprise, you can be found guilty of committing a crime even if there is no evidence that you personally perpetrated it or even knew about it. Right. So if you're in a position of, say, just as an example, if you are theoretically under JCE, if you are the head of a police department and a low-ranking officer within your department commits a crime, you can be found guilty for that, even if you didn't endorse it, know about it, or yes, commit it yourself. And despite the fact they made the they stacked the deck against Milosevic and made the legal terms so broad, they still couldn't land a killer blow on him. And I might add that throughout the prosecution trial, it was clear that Milosevic, and we'll get into this, was getting ill. Now, when it came time at long last for the defense portion of his trial to begin, the ICTY, on the grounds of his ill health, imposed defense counsel on him. So they refused to let him defend himself, in effect, which he wanted to do, which is like a breach of basic legal norms pretty much anywhere in the world, right? And I might add that they did the same to Saddam Hussein. They imposed his legal team upon him, and it was comprised of former spooks and military people from Western countries. Now, you know, it seems like reasonable speculation to suggest that he had played his hand so masterfully during the prosecution process that they were shitting themselves about if it came to his defense, that if he was allowed to defend himself in court and call his own witnesses and provide his own evidence. So, you know, there was that. But of course, his trial never ended because in 2006, he died in rather questionable circumstances in The Hague.
Yes, which of course has led to a number of a lot of speculation regarding like what ultimately happened here. But it seems that at the very least, they put him in a situation where any pre-existing medical condition was going to get worse. They, it is said, denied him proper medication for a heart condition, and of course that they were more than happy to see him ultimately die, because there was every chance that he was going to get off on the charges that they'd brought against him. And indeed, ultimately and posthumously, he was cleared of the charges that were brought against him. So this is a complete disaster for the ICTY, and shot its credibility to shit, basically. And had Milosevic been alive to conduct his own defense, there's every chance that all of what we're talking about here, or a great deal of it that we've included in these two episodes, that Milosevic himself would have been able to outline to the entire world, and was starting to do so. And they realized that they'd made a huge mistake in sticking him on trial. And so the next best thing is, well, we'd best just dispose of him then, which is what many argue, and I believe myself, they ultimately did. But I wanted to ask you, Kit, how is this viewed in Serbia now with regard to the ultimate fate of Milosevic?
Well, I mean, I might add as well, just as a preface to this, that like one of an absolutely hilarious development over the course of Milosevic's trial was that a large number of pundits and journalists and politicians who had wanted a very public show trial of Milosevic and been ardent advocates of this, started arguing publicly that the ICTY should stop televising its proceedings, because he was coming across so well that actually that he was garnering significant public sympathy and support in not only within Serbia but elsewhere. You know, I mean, it's quite incredible. But the point is that he was getting very, very, very sick being held in The Hague, and numerous requests for him to undergo treatment in Russia or elsewhere, or be released on compassionate grounds so he could, you know, live out like, you know, the last days of his life, like not in a cold cell in Amsterdam, were denied. Now, excuse me, he was suffering particularly from high blood pressure, and yet when he died, there was a medicine called rifampicin that was found in his blood, which would have counteracted the high blood pressure medication he was also taking, and would have increased the risk of a heart attack that he ultimately suffered from and died. Okay, so and what's even more interesting is that there are various references to his death in the WikiLeaks US State Department cables, which state that Dutch doctors were not telling Milosevic about, they were not giving him his health reports, or and they were withholding medical records from him due to alleged confidentiality concerns. I mean, again, that is just completely insane that someone can't see their own medical records. I mean, you know, so I think that, yeah, it is pretty much universally believed in Serbia, as far in my experience, that yes, that he was offed, and it was done in order to prevent further awkward and embarrassing disclosures and his potential exoneration. Now, like, you know, like I mentioned, the conviction of Karadzic, the very lengthy judgment. It contains all of these completely exculpatory sections in it, that, you know, that had Slobodan Milosevic lived, could have pointed to in his defense. Like, you know, and it also found that there was no evidence to support the notion, which was key to Milosevic's indictment, that he supported the common plan to permanently remove Bosniaks, which is to say Slavic Muslims, or Croats, from Serb-held territory. Quite the reverse, in fact, and it came out during his trial. Very few people know this, but when Rump Yugoslavia was effectively created in May 1992, its constitution stated Yugoslavia makes no territorial claims whatsoever on territory in any other country. Right. So, like, you know, I think that, yes, that even if we believe that this was just a death of natural causes with no meddling or, like, you know, deliberate efforts to hasten his demise and hinder his ability to access medical support. I mean, there was presumably a lot more that could have and would have come out in his favor, if the defense section of his trial went ahead. You know, I mean, and I mean, just as a further testament to just what an absolute, I mean, it's an offence to kangaroos to call this a kangaroo court. There is a Bosniak warlord called Nasser Oric, who he openly boasted about killing Serbs every day, going into Serb villages on Orthodox Christmas to murder the entire, you know, population. He also showed a number of Western journalists videos of his quote-unquote greatest hits, showing the corpses of Serbs that he'd murdered via a variety of means. He was tried on low-level charges of mistreating detainees, was found innocent on most charges, and again sentenced to time served. And, you know, witnesses at other trials who testified to his war crimes were not called to testify at his own trial. Yeah, it was a complete and utter sham from start to finish. And yet it is cited as a gold standard in international law, and is attributed with the birth of the International Criminal Court. You know, it's really quite extraordinary.
Well, it really does depend what you're looking for. If you're looking for a tribunal that essentially delivered like results that are entirely fictional, which justify the destruction of a form of socialism and the reduction of the countries that used to form Yugoslavia into like a series of neo-colonies, then the ICTY and all that is associated with it is an outstanding success. Which the ICC seeks to, of course, continue the track record of, including right down to like farcical indictments against people like Rodrigo Duterte, who is currently away on trial whilst being re-elected mayor of his home city, for carrying out things which, of course, the US warmly approves of in its chosen men. But just start back to the question of like Milosevic and the future, because Milosevic his real crime, as we discussed last week, and I think we should re-emphasize here, his real crime was not supporting a greater Serbia. He didn't, as you know, was even the ICTY was forced to conclude. His real crime was not some sort of, ethno-Serb nationalism. Again, he wasn't that either. That was entirely a work of fiction on behalf of like CIA MI6. What his real crime was that he wanted to retain, as far as was possible, Yugoslavia, wanted to retain its independence and sovereignty, and didn't want to see it reduced to a neo-colony of the West. That was what his crime was. And all of the things that people my age and older grew up with, looking at on the television, reading in the newspapers, all of this crap is just like complete works of fiction. This is stuff that Jeffrey Archer would be ashamed to write because it's so ludicrous. But this is the story that they told us. And it doesn't matter whether you are a liberal leftist reading The Guardian, or whether you consider yourself some sort of old English patriot reading The Sun, or whether you're a devotee of like BBC or ITN or Sky News or whatever. They all told the same story, which is evil Serb nationalists want to destroy all these brave Croats / Bosniaks / Albanians who just want to be free. And the reality was, of course, a long-term Western plot using Croat fascists, Bosniak fascists, Kosovan fascists to destroy a form of socialism, which, however imperfect, had improved life enormously in what the countries that used to be called Yugoslavia. And that since it has been destroyed, all of those places, other than Serbia itself, have been reduced to just being puppet states of the West. And so my final point of discussion that we have for today is, and this is mainly a question for you, Kit, is that where do things go in the former Yugoslavia now, in terms of like, is there in the newer generation support for some kind of like pan-Slavic union in the way that there once was? Can the damage done by the breakup of Yugoslavia 30 years ago hope to be undone? But from your perspective as a resident there, what do you see?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that there is a wider yearning. I mean, and this is not just based on excuse me, my experiences of living in Serbia, but traveling around the wider region. That that quote unquote independence isn't all it's cracked up to be. This is something that I encounter frequently. And if you look at, like, I mean, even supposed success stories from the former Yugoslavia, like Croatia, it has massive issues around lack of employment opportunities, high, unsustainable living costs, also massive population drain. As people seek higher salaries and better lives elsewhere. This is the story across the region, because yes, poverty wages, very little in the way of work unless you want to work for a Western funded NGO of some kind. But I think that more generally, as we've been discussing, the fact of the matter is that wannabe statelets like Kosovo, or say the complete and utter disaster that is Bosnia and Herzegovina, these are relics of the unipolar world, which are completely unsustainable without Western support, and that is by sheer political gravity waning. So if you look, I mean, to give Bosnia, to use Bosnia as a just as an example, Bosnia is home to 25,600 separate foreign-funded NGOs. Right, this is in a country with a population of under 3 million, I think. I mean, it's quite insane. And they fulfill every basic function of government. The central government is completely dysfunctional. They never pass legislation because they have 3 presidents, a Croat, a Bosniak, and a Serb, who never agree on anything. They're governed by a foreign appointed and born high representative who wields ultimate power. And then you have, basically 2 internal republics within Bosnia, one called, helpfully, Bosnia and Herzegovina, the other called Republika Srpska. Republika Srpska is moving just, again, by sheer gravity, but also due to the wishes and wills of its population, which is mixed between Croats and Bosniaks and Serbs still, and its leadership, which is kind of is nationalist and unsavory in many ways. They are moving towards independence purely because the system doesn't work, and I think that the second that US support evaporates in the manner of yes, the 1,000 US soldiers standing between Serbia and Kosovo, then the frameworks and the institutions and all of the other bullshit that keep the former components of Yugoslavia mutually resentful microstates are gone. Enormous amounts of money is pumped by the US and the EU into ensuring that Bosniaks and Serbs remain divided. At least on a kind of national political level. So if you go to any town or city of any size in Bosnia, they will have a local museum of genocide, which is usually funded by some CIA front foundation, like in Germany or whatnot. All of the text inside is in English, so it's quite clear it's not for local consumption. And it's once that once all of that goes, what are you left with? All of the sources of division are external, just as the forces of division that broke up Yugoslavia were external. And I think that my experience of traveling around the region is that on a personal level, that this alleged animosity, which didn't exist before the wars of the 90s, was created by the wars of the 90s, it's not there anymore. People are not segregated, and they want to get on with their lives and live in peace with their neighbors. And it's also well understood that that as quote unquote independent countries, they don't have collective bargaining power. They're effectively completely defenseless from Western economic and political predation. There are moves to create a Balkan Union that has, again, that's occurring within a framework of US and EU oversight and direction, which is problematic. But ideas of a Balkan federation stretch back, as we discussed last week, to the late 1800s, and that is a pervasive view locally, as far in my experience.
Yeah, and so what we're faced with now is essentially this brings us to the end of our story, or this part of the story, which is that for all of the chaos and destruction and the mass slaughter that the imperialist powers unleashed on the once and future Yugoslavia, it will ultimately fall apart and fail, because the newer generation, indeed, even the older generations, and here I'll just jump back to something that we said last week, that according to opinion surveys taken in the late 1980s, the number of people in all of the Yugoslav states who identified as Yugoslav over the constituent republic identity was actually higher in the late 80s than it ever had been. So this is something which is, of course, again, and this is part of what we do on this program, and I think it's part of the reason why the program is doing well, is we speak as people who had to deprogram ourselves from the bullshit that we grew up with. We all have to. And so therefore, you all watching this, whether you are British, in which case, get ready for our own breakup, or you are in the US, or you are in a European nation or Western European imperialist power, you have to accept that everything you were told about Yugoslavia was wrong. And it was a confection, a complete series of lies. See, what happened was not that the Serbs, Croats, Bosniaks, Albanians, Slovenians, Montenegrins, and Macedonians just couldn't live with each other anymore. What happened was two things. One, the central government's authority imploded and it lost the ability and the will to actually exert itself anymore due to various different factors, including pressure from the imperialists. And two, the imperialists empowered very small minorities in these countries to essentially run riot and create chaos. And this is what they did in every single Yugoslav constituent republic that broke away. And it could have easily have been crushed politically or militarily by the central Yugoslav government had that government not been systematically undermined by the imperialists and also by its own inadequacies. And so not all the things we were told were wrong. And when the some form of pan-Slavic federation reemerges, don't be surprised if that happens within the next few years. And it includes areas which we've been told can't possibly live with the Serbs, can't possibly live with the Muslims. And we have to face reality than a resident of perfidious Albion or a resident of the USA. Kit, I'll throw to you for final words and final reflection.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I hope that we have illuminated some unknown and inconvenient truths with this two-parter. Please do check out like the first part, which is kind of lays the foundations for this edition. But just more generally, as we've discussed on this show before, I think that from the perspective of a lot of people in the Balkans, in the manner of that wonderful quote from the Taliban, you have watches, we have time. People in the Balkans have a very, very, very strong connection to the lands in which they were born, in which their ancestors fought and died for their freedom, and that is far more potent than OPCOR or a Srebrenica memorial NGO, and that will endure once the US is gone. And and we can hope that in the manner of these things, the mistakes of the past are learned from, and something better is built once the NATO occupation ends, which could be sooner than we think.
Yes, coming soon. And when that happens, we will be here to cover it on the Decline and Fall show, which, as the title suggests, is tracking the decline and fall of the Anglo-American Empire, rapidly accelerating as time goes on. And you can look forward to another program this week, which will be going out on the Friday of this week, which is the 16th, which will be covering the latest in the ongoing story of the decline and fall of the Anglo-American Empire. But until then, it only remains for us to say thank you to everybody who watches, shares, and supports the show. Be sure to subscribe to our YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and Substack platforms. All support that you can give us helps us build this up and helps us develop this as I would call it, a news and educational program. So thank you to everybody who's tuned in. We'll be seeing you again very soon. And it only remains for us to salute the memory of those who fell to create socialist Yugoslavia and the actions of those who to come who will recreate it anew.
God bless you guys. Take care.
Thanks, everybody, and good night.